That little plastic pin, my father sneered, tapping my captain insignia. You really think that makes you someone? My mother didn't even look up. She just whispered, Chloe's new Tesla costs more than your whole career. I stood there, uniform stiff, heart breaking in silence, as the people who raised me laughed at the one thing I bled for. I swore this time I wouldn't stay silent. My name is Petra Nance. I'm 27 years old, a newly promoted captain in the United States Army Logistics Branch. And today I stood in full dress uniform at Fort Sam Houston's historic quadrangle, ready to receive the insignia that marked my years of sacrifice, service, and sleepless deployments. The morning sun filtered through the live oaks, casting shadows across the parade ground. The deer that always wandered the quadrangle grazed quietly near the stone wall. They didn't care about ceremonies or silver bars. But I did. I had earned this moment. The air was thick with ceremony, clean lines of green uniforms, crisp commands, and the quiet shuffle of boots on the old stone. Colonel Davis, silver-haired and steel-spined, was speaking about my service, how I'd spent nights rerouting broken convoys during flooding in Louisiana, how I ensured our battalion never missed a beat despite budget cuts and bureaucratic nightmares. It was everything I had worked for, and yet I kept glancing toward the folding chairs set out for my family. My father, Marcus Nance, was scrolling his phone, stock graphs flickering across his screen. My mother, Eleanor, dabbed at her lipstick using a compact mirror that caught the sun. Chloe, my little sister, Instagram famous and dripping in red, was pouting into her camera, posing with the bored detachment of someone dragged to a farmer's market. None of them looked at me. When Colonel Davis called me forward, my boots struck the pavement like gunshots. I moved with purpose, spine straight, steps measured. He took the new insignia, 2 silver bars, polished and bright, and affixed them to my shoulder. The moment should have been sacred. Instead, my father leaned in. Wrap up this military theater, Petra, he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. The whole family's outside with Chloe's new Tesla. That's worth celebrating, not that cheap piece of metal. My lungs didn't expand. Then came my mother's voice, soft and sugar-laced. He's right, Marcus, it's red. Matches her Instagram aesthetic perfectly. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was the roar of everything inside me collapsing at once. They turned my proudest moment into an afterthought, a prop, a backdrop for their curated lives. I didn't speak. I'd been trained to withstand worse, to square my shoulders, swallow pain, and march forward. That's exactly what I did. But inside I was screaming. I saw Colonel Davis shift, catching something in my expression. Maybe he'd seen that flicker of betrayal. But he said nothing. He only nodded once, slow and deliberate, and moved on to the next name on the list. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw First Sergeant Frank Miller. He stood at attention with the rest of the unit, but his eyes, those battle-hardened, weathered eyes, were locked on mine. He'd seen what happened. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than applause. His gaze held no pity, only fierce respect. Later, when we gathered informally near the flagpole, most families huddled close, laughing, taking pictures. Mine had already disappeared. I didn't look for them. Miller came over, cup of black coffee in hand, and handed me a spare. "They don't get it, ma'am," he said, "but we do." I stared at the steam rising from the cup. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. "Never does," he muttered. "But that doesn't make what you did any smaller." I nodded, throat tight. In that second, I understood something terrifying and true. The approval I'd yearned for from my family would never come. but from my soldiers, from the men and women who knew what it meant to carry weight others never see. That respect was real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I walked alone back to my on-base apartment that evening, still in uniform. I didn't take the bars off. I let them sit there, cold, gleaming, real. Passing civilians nodded. Some thanked me for my service. Small gestures that pierced deeper than they knew. Inside, I hung my jacket with precision, sat on the edge of my neatly made bed, looked at the photo of me and my class at officer candidate school, and I thought about what it cost me. Sleep, comfort, connection, family. I thought about the girl in that photo, still hoping that one day her parents would be proud enough to show up and just be present. I'm not her anymore. I walked to my small kitchen, still in boots, and opened the fridge. Just leftover grilled chicken and a bottle of Gatorade. I took a bite, barely tasting anything, then stood there in the glow of the open door, thinking. They hadn't forgotten the ceremony. They just didn't care. That realization cut deeper than anything they'd said. I rinsed my plate, wiped the sink, and stood for a moment, staring at the wall. There, tacked above my desk, was the commendation letter I received after a 72-hour supply run during Hurricane Harvey. No one at home ever asked about it. But Miller did. So did my team. They read it like it mattered. That's what family was supposed to do. See you, hear you. Not just tolerate your achievements, but feel pride in them. As I saluted that afternoon, the silver bar on my shoulder caught the sun. A symbol, they had called it. My father called it cheap, but to me it was earned. Burned into long nights and hard decisions. It was mine, and no amount of silence, lipstick, or luxury cars could take that from me. I stared at the silver bar on my shoulder, still catching light even hours after the ceremony. That cheap piece of metal, as my father called it, kept shimmering like it was trying to remind me of something. And it did. It reminded me that this wasn't the first time my value had been dismissed by the people who were supposed to see me first. We had dinner that night on the San Antonio River Walk. Not to celebrate my promotion, but because Chloe wanted photos in front of the boats and lights. Dad insisted on the steakhouse with outdoor seating and white linen tablecloths. When we arrived, he placed Chloe's Tesla key right in the center of the table like a trophy. The waiter hadn't even brought bread yet, and Chloe was already filming her water glass in slow motion for a story. I tried to speak, tried to share something real. I'll be doing survival training out at Fort Bliss next month, I said, easing into conversation. 3 weeks in full gear, no contact, it's the hardest phase. Mom didn't look up. She just let out this soft, dismissive laugh. Oh, Petra, sweetheart, can we not talk about mud and gear during dinner? Let's not ruin our appetites. She turned to Chloe, suddenly excited. So, Napa Valley this weekend. Do you think you'll wear the white romper or the green silk? The light out there is gorgeous. I swallowed my words and cut my steak. Medium rare, no flavor. Chloe snapped another photo. No one asked me anything else. Later that night, walking back to my apartment, I kept hearing that laugh of hers. It wasn't new. It had been echoing in my head for years. I was 17 when I made it to the finals of the National Speech and Debate Championship in D.C. One of the judges shook my hand afterward and told me I had a voice like command. I believed him. I called home that night, voice trembling with pride, and told Dad I'd placed in the top 3 nationally. He said the flights were too expensive to come. I understood. Until a week later, when they flew to Aspen, first class, for Chloe's ski trip. That memory clung to me like frost. I remembered the summer I turned 18, when I saved every tip I earned at the cafe near our high school. I scrubbed syrup off tables, refilled coffee for truckers, and walked home in the Texas heat just to scrape together enough to buy a used Ford Ranger. Old red rattled over potholes like a tin can, but it ran. When I brought it home, Dad stood in the driveway, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting my dusty pride. "Marcus Nance's daughter doesn't drive trash," he said. Then he told me to park it on the curb. 2 months later, Chloe turned 18. She cried because she cracked the fender on her Mini. Dad surprised her with a brand new white BMW convertible. I watched from the porch. She squealed, hugged him, posed for pictures. No one remembered my truck. But what cut deeper than all that was the promise. The one he made when I shipped off to basic. "Make it to captain," he said, "and I'll buy you any car you want. You deserve to ride like an officer." At the time, I clung to those words like a lifeline, but they vanished. Now Chloe had the car, bright red, leather seats. The one he said was too flashy for me. He never mentioned the promise again. They didn't forget. They chose not to remember. Sometimes I wonder, have any of you ever been praised in public, only to be privately diminished, or had a moment of pride stolen by silence? If so, you're not alone. That kind of pain sits heavy, like a medal no one pins on you, but you wear anyway. That night, I didn't cry. I just sat on my bed, still in uniform, watching the clock. I thought of all the other people who had someone waiting with flowers, with tears, with pride in their eyes. I thought about what it would feel like to be seen, not just looked at, but truly seen. And then I reminded myself, I'm not the girl waiting for their approval anymore. I earned my stripes without applause. And that's more than some people ever do. The uniform was still hanging by my door, stiff with starch and ceremony. I walked over, fingers brushing the shoulder bars, remembering how it felt to stand so still while the world around me moved past, like I was invisible. I poured myself a glass of water, no ice, and stared at the blank TV screen, not turning it on. There was no noise I wanted to drown in tonight. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a stack of old letters, training evaluations, and one printed photo from Fort Leonard Wood. Me standing knee-deep in a muddy trench, grin wide, face caked in sweat and dirt. That day, no one had cheered for me either. But I'd gotten the supply route cleared. We'd made quota. I was proud. I pressed the photo to the desk for a moment and whispered, they never had to understand. They just had to care. But they didn't. And I think that hurt most of all. The next morning, I made eggs, pulled on my running shoes, and stepped out just as the sky turned gray-blue. They may never clap for me, but I will keep showing up anyway. Because real honor doesn't need an audience. I turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to my apartment just off base. The room was dark, still. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew where everything was. My boots clicked against the laminate floor as I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and starch. My space was spotless, almost clinical. A single couch, one bookshelf. The dinner table doubled as a workspace. The walls were bare, except for a small corkboard above my desk, pinned with training schedules and checklists. In the fridge, 6 containers of prepped meals. Chicken breast, steamed broccoli, brown rice. I pulled one out and placed it in the microwave. No sauces, no seasoning, just fuel. The hum of the appliance was the only sound in the room. I sat down at the counter and ate in silence. Fork, chew, swallow, repeat. I didn't need luxury. I needed discipline. but discipline didn't warm a room. I thought about the steakhouse from the night before. White tablecloths, ambient music, overpriced cocktails. My family's laughter echoing like a show I was never cast in. I had worn my uniform. Chloe had worn designer heels. Guess who got complimented more? My phone buzzed. First Sergeant Miller, the caller ID read. I hesitated, then answered. Captain Nance. His voice was rough but steady. Ma'am, sorry to call late. He paused. I just wanted to say, don't let them shake you. What you've done, what you do every day. They'll never get it, but we do. Every damn one of us. We see you, we're behind you. I didn't answer right away. My throat closed up. He added, we don't say it much, but the platoon talks, ma'am. You've earned their respect. That's not nothing. Thank you, Sergeant, I managed. My voice cracked on the last word. It was the only tear I let fall that day. Not out of sadness, but because for the first time in 24 hours, I felt seen, not applauded, not celebrated, just understood. After the call, I opened my laptop. A spreadsheet filled the screen. Columns of serial numbers, shipment dates, coordination contacts for the upcoming National Training Center rotation in the Mojave. Fuel logistics, convoy timing, crew shift alignment. All of it rode on my planning. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something you could post on Instagram, but it mattered. I remembered one weekend when I tried explaining it to my father. He had leaned back in his leather office chair, arms folded, barely looking up from his monitor. So you schedule trucks? I'd explained again. How it wasn't just vehicles. It was managing supply chains in combat simulations, preparing units to deploy under fire. He'd waved a hand. Sweetheart, the logistics team at my company does the same thing, except they don't need boots or barbed wire. You could be doing that here and making 6 figures. To him, it was simple. Anything not involving profit was charity, and charity was weakness. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in my chair. My eyes drifted to the orders posted above my desk. PCS in 60 days. New assignment pending. Which meant another packing cycle, another goodbye, another base. I was used to it. Permanent change of station, permanent disruption. I'd done it alone every time. Booked my own movers, handled my own housing, negotiated leave time. My parents never asked how it worked. They just assumed I snapped, and the Army made it happen. On the floor near my closet sat a single duffel bag, already half-packed. Uniforms rolled tight, socks folded by color. I had a system. People think resilience is this loud, defiant thing. But sometimes it's a quiet pattern, a checklist, a clean apartment, a plain dinner. A silence you learn to live inside without falling apart. The next morning, I rose at 5:30. Routine, muscle memory. Brushed my teeth, tied my laces, ran 5 miles on streets still wet with dew. By the time the sun came up, I was already showered, dressed, and seated with a cup of black coffee. My inbox was filling with questions from junior officers about the Mojave rotation. I answered each one, line by line, no shortcuts, no complaints, because this is what I do, and who I am. I don't need a round of applause. I don't need a dinner party toast. I just need a mission, and the space to do it without being diminished. And if that space doesn't come from the people who share my last name, then I'll build it myself. Later that day, I stopped by the post office on base to pick up a package. Just a new set of regulation PT gear. The clerk behind the counter nodded respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, that one word carried more validation than any backhanded compliment I'd ever received at a country club brunch. Walking back to my apartment, I passed a group of new recruits in formation. Their cadence echoed against the concrete, sharp, rhythmic, united. It reminded me why I stayed in, why I endured. Not for the pay, not for the medals, but for the weight of responsibility that no one else volunteers for. This life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every orderly drawer, every labeled folder, every silent salute, proof that I was still here, still standing. And when the next PCS came, I'd shoulder the load again, not because anyone asked me to, but because I never stopped believing the mission mattered, even if no one clapped when I walked in the room. The balcony faced west, out toward the rolling hills of San Antonio, where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in layers of amber and rust. I sat in my chair, still in uniform pants and a faded gray t-shirt, hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. It was empty, like me. The silence was sharp tonight. No music, no news, not even the fan running. I didn't want to hear anything except the sound of a voice that might understand. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the contacts slowly, my thumb hesitating at one name, Iris, my grandmother. She lived out in Fredericksburg, in a little white house with blue shutters and a rose garden that always looked half wild and half magical. She didn't do Instagram, barely checked email, but she always answered the phone. I hit call, 2 rings. "Petra, sweetheart," she said, like she'd been waiting all evening. "I was just thinking about you." My throat tightened. "Hi, Grandma." She didn't ask about the promotion dinner. She didn't mention my parents or Chloe. Instead, she asked one question. "How does it feel to carry 2 bars on your shoulder now, honey? Does it feel heavier?" I blinked, then blinked again. That was the question. Not what did they give you, not did Chloe take pictures, but this. She saw it, understood it. Rank wasn't decoration, it was weight. "Yeah," I said, voice cracking. "It does." "Of course it does," she said, calm and sure, like a warm quilt. "Your granddad used to say that every stripe and star came with someone else's burden attached to it. More bars, more weight." I looked out at the dusk settling over the hilltops and felt my lungs finally let go of the breath they'd been holding all day. I told her everything about the steakhouse, about Chloe's car key sitting like a trophy in the middle of the table, about the laugh that cut through my story, about the silence that followed me back home like a shadow. And she just listened. No interruptions, no outrage, no defense. When I finally stopped, the line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your granddad, the colonel, he once told me the difference between a soldier and a civilian. A soldier knows some things are more important than their own life. Your parents, they don't understand that, Petra. That's not on you." I pressed the heel of my hand to my eyes. "It still hurts. I know," she said gently. "But that's not weakness. That's proof your heart's still working." She paused, then added, "You didn't get your strength from nowhere. You come from a long line of stubborn patriots, honey. I've seen that steel in your spine since you were 9 years old and organizing your cousins into backyard drills." I smiled, despite myself. "You remember that? You made them salute the mailbox." We both laughed. It felt like stepping into sunlight after too long in the cold. She shifted tone, soft but certain. "Listen, this weekend, why don't you drive out here? I'll make fried chicken, real crispy like you love, and my potato salad. We'll sit on the porch and drink sweet tea. And we won't talk about them. We'll talk about you." The offer wasn't flashy. It wasn't a trip to Napa Valley, but it landed somewhere deep inside me, in a place that had been aching for weeks. "I'd love that," I whispered. "Good," she said. "Come Saturday. I'll have the garden chairs hosed off by then. And don't bring a thing except your appetite and your stories." After we hung up, I didn't move for a while. Outside, the sky had turned navy, a few stars peeking through. The quiet wasn't so heavy now. It was just still, not empty. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to carry it all alone. Fredericksburg wasn't just a place anymore. It was a direction, a reason to get in the car and drive. A reminder that someone, somewhere, saw me. Not as a problem to manage or a rank to ignore, but as Petra, a girl who'd worked hard, a soldier who kept showing up. I stood, folded the blanket from the chair, and walked back inside. The apartment didn't look so cold now. The same walls, the same light. But something in me had shifted. Not everything had to be solved tonight. But now I had a destination, and a place that still made room for me, without expectation or performance. Just a porch, and a plate of fried chicken. I went to the closet and pulled out an old overnight bag, green canvas fraying at the edges. The same one I'd used for weekend drills back when I was still an ROTC cadet. Tossed in a clean shirt, socks, jeans, and my running shoes. I didn't need much. Next, I reached for the photo I kept tucked behind a book on my shelf. It was the three of us, Grandma, Grandpa in his marine dress blues, and me, maybe 10, holding his officer's cap way too big for my head. The corner of the photo was smudged, the colors faded, but the feeling in it was still bright. Pride, belonging. This wasn't about retreat, it was about remembrance. Reclaiming something that had always been mine. I set the photo inside the bag, zipped it closed, and set it by the door. Saturday would come soon, and for once, I didn't dread the weekend. My phone rang just as I was pouring coffee into a travel mug, getting ready to head out for a morning run. I didn't even glance at the screen, just answered instinctively. "Hi, sweetheart," came the overly bright voice of my mother, Eleanor. That one tone was enough to make my stomach twist. "Hi, Mom," I said, guarded. "I was just thinking about you," she said, too smoothly. "Wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Everything okay after your big ceremony?" "I'm fine," I said, knowing this wasn't a wellness call. "Good, good," she continued. "You know Chloe's graduating soon, from UT, magna cum laude, you know. Well, she says it's just a technicality, but still." There it was, the lead up. And it turns out USAA's headquarters is right there in San Antonio. Isn't that funny? Right where you're stationed. I said nothing, just waited. "So," she pressed on, "I was wondering, do you know anyone over there? Or maybe you could call someone. As a captain, I'm sure you could put in a good word. A recommendation, just to get her resume in the right hands." I closed my eyes and let the silence hang. "Petra?" she chirped. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you," I said quietly. "And no, I can't do that." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said with a laugh that was anything but amused. "You're always so by the book. It's not like you'd be forging anything. Just a phone call, a little push. Families help each other." I drew in a slow breath. "Mom, I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Using my rank or position to influence private sector hiring for personal connections is unethical and possibly illegal. That's not something I'm willing to compromise." Her tone shifted immediately, the sweetness gone like a flipped switch. "Unethical? Petra, for God's sake, she's your sister. You're really going to throw her under the bus over some rule? Why are you always like this? Rigid, cold, just like your father says." I said nothing. "Or maybe," she continued, voice sharpening, "you're just afraid she'll outshine you. That's it, isn't it? She's already younger, prettier, and if she lands this job, well, I guess you won't be the only successful one in the family anymore." The words hit like a slap, not because I believed them, but because they revealed everything. I wasn't a daughter to her, I was a resource. "I'm hanging up now," I said. "Fine," she snapped. "But don't come crying when Chloe makes something of herself, and you're still out there playing war." She ended the call before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, my thumb trembling over the screen. Not from sadness, from fury and disgust. It wasn't that they didn't understand the uniform I wore. It was that they didn't care. My service, my sacrifices, my code. It was all just leverage to them, something to be used when convenient, ignored when not. The warmth I'd felt from Grandma's voice the night before vanished like a candle snuffed out. In its place, a cold, hollow silence. I sat down on the couch, coffee forgotten, the phone still in my hand. They hadn't called to reconnect. They hadn't called to apologize. They'd called because they wanted something. Again, my uniform wasn't armor to them. It was currency. My rank wasn't a symbol of responsibility. It was a discount code they wanted to cash in. I stood slowly and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. My hands curled into fists before I even realized. This wasn't hurt anymore. It was betrayal, plain and sharp. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Grandma's words echo. "You didn't get your strength from nowhere." I wasn't going to let them buy pieces of me. Not anymore. And if that meant stepping further away from them to protect what I stood for, so be it. My silence wasn't weakness. It was resolve. I walked to the window, cracked it open, and let in the morning air. San Antonio's dry breeze brushed my cheek. Somewhere in the courtyard below, a lawnmower hummed to life. Routine, steady, honest. The kind of noise that didn't ask anything from me. I looked around my apartment. The neatly stacked duffel bags, my calendar with the PCS date circled in red, the printout of the NTC deployment schedule taped to the fridge. Everything in this place had a purpose. Everything I'd built had meaning. And then I thought of Chloe, how she trashed her last car and was rewarded with a BMW. How she'd never worked a double shift, never stood in formation at 400, never had to explain what mission readiness meant to people who thought she just moved papers around. And now they wanted me to hand her a shortcut. I sat down at my desk and opened the drawer where I kept the handwritten letter my commanding officer had given me after our last rotation. He'd praised my leadership, my decisiveness, my integrity under pressure. That letter meant more to me than 1,000 empty compliments from anyone else. I ran a finger over the ink. No, I wasn't going to betray that. Not for Chloe, not for anyone. The sand stung my cheeks as we crawled low across the training pit at Fort Sam Houston. The sun was merciless, and sweat clung to every inch of my uniform. My thighs burned, my elbows throbbed, and yet it wasn't the drills that would leave a scar that day. During a quick break, I checked my phone. One new email. Subject line: "Great news about the Highland Park house." I opened it, squinting past the glare of the Texas sun. It was from my father, Marcus, CC'd to Eleanor and Chloe. Just one paragraph, typed like a business memo. "Hi everyone, great news. Closed an excellent deal on the old house. Buyer went above asking. Should be a solid boost for the new real estate fund I'm launching. Petra, if you have any leftover stuff in your room, let me know soon so I can send a crew over to clear it out. They're taking possession in 60 days. I didn't breathe for a full 10 seconds. They sold the house where I grew up, the house with my childhood height still etched into the doorframe of the hallway closet, the house with the creaky floorboard outside my bedroom I used to avoid when sneaking in late from debate meets. The house with the big oak tree in the backyard, the one I fell out of when I was 9, fracturing my wrist but insisting I was army tough. All gone, no phone call, no heads up, just a group email. Like I was a tenant being informed of a lease termination. My chest tightened, heat rising up my neck. It wasn't just the property, it was memory, roots, the last tangible thing tying me to anything remotely sentimental in that family. Now listed, now leveraged. I read the email again. Real estate fund? Of course. To them, nothing was sacred unless it made a return on investment. I looked around the training grounds. Soldiers hustled, barked commands, pushed through grit and fatigue. They had sweat on their brows and sand in their boots, but every one of them showed up for something bigger than themselves. Meanwhile, my parents couldn't even pick up a phone to tell me they were erasing my childhood. I stood, letting the wind dry the sweat on my brow. Lunch could wait. I walked toward the edge of the lot, boots crunching against gravel, pulled off my gloves, exhaled. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I'd been trained better than that. What I felt wasn't fire. It was ice, precision, focus. They wanted me erased, not just emotionally, but physically. Selling the house wasn't about convenience. It was about control. Reclaiming their narrative, scrubbing mine. But they forgot one thing. I don't disappear quietly. I reached for my dog tags, pressing the cool metal against my chest. I remembered what Grandma Iris had said. There are people in this world who will only understand the value of something once it's gone. Don't let them decide what you're worth. Well, they wouldn't. That night, back in my apartment, I gathered the documents I had stored. Letters, pictures, bank records, even old emails Eleanor had forwarded me years ago. Ones she never expected I'd keep. But I kept everything. I always had. I labeled folders, highlighted patterns, pieced together timelines. Like I was prepping an op order, because in a way, I was. My mission wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. For the Petra who painted her own bedroom blue and covered it with army posters. For the Petra who read marine memoirs under a flashlight long after curfew. For the Petra who stood in that house and believed she mattered. They wanted to sell my memories? Let them. I'd build something they couldn't touch. To those of you listening, have you ever felt it? That moment when your silence breaks, not in noise but in action. When enough is finally enough. If you have, then you know exactly where I stood that night. I wasn't their obedient daughter anymore. I was a soldier, a strategist, a survivor, and now I was ready to fight. I opened my closet and took out a storage bin labeled personal. Inside were framed photos, my high school varsity debate ribbons, an Army ROTC pin from my college days, and a faded postcard from Grandpa Ed, sent from Okinawa during his last deployment. I held the postcard gently. On the back, in his looping script, it read, "Never forget who you are, even when the world wants to rewrite it." They could sell the house, but they couldn't erase my history. I stared at the bin for a moment longer, then slid it under my bed. Tomorrow, I'd call my CU and ask to speak with the JAG liaison about personal boundary enforcement during PCS. Not because I was scared, but because I was going to do this the right way. I was done reacting. It was time to move forward with purpose. I pulled out my planner and started listing the steps: legal inquiries, storage transfers, and an appointment with a therapist on base. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else got to define how I closed my own chapters. This wasn't just a severance. This was a declaration. I closed the planner, and for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. After the training debrief, I got into my car, turned off the GPS voice, and drove west on I-10. The late afternoon sun bathed Texas Hill Country in a soft gold hue, brushing every hill with long shadows. The road unspooled before me, wide, open, familiar. Blue bonnets were long gone this late in the summer, replaced by scorched grass and brittle fences. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for the view. I was chasing something solid. Fredericksburg sat quietly under the lowering sun. When I pulled in to Grandma Iris's gravel driveway, the porch light clicked on, though I hadn't texted. As I stepped out of the car, she opened the front door like she'd been standing there the whole time. "Come on in, baby," she said gently, her voice like warm cedar. "I knew you'd come." She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. I sat at her kitchen table, that old one with the nicked corners and faded placemats. I laid it out, not with tears, not with rage. I delivered it like a field report, clear, calm, clipped. My voice barely rose above a whisper, but my pulse throbbed behind every word. Grandma listened, nodding occasionally, hands clasped as if in prayer. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she stood without a word, disappeared into the back bedroom, and returned holding something wrapped in cloth. It was Grandpa Ed's Bible. She placed it in front of me, then slowly opened it. Not to the Gospels, not to Psalms, but to Proverbs. "Proverbs 31, she said quietly, verses 8 and 9. Her finger rested on the page. "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." She looked up at me, eyes steady. "Your grandfather believed a true officer doesn't just command, she protects, even when the person who needs defending is herself." I didn't respond right away. My throat was tight. "You don't have to shout, Petra," she said. "You don't have to break things to be heard. But you do have to speak, truthfully, calmly, with clarity, and you have to be ready for them to hate you for it." I nodded. That night, the kitchen table became a war room. We pulled out my manila folders, my email printouts, the notebook I'd kept during PCS prep. I showed her the group email about selling the house, the text from Chloe begging for just one contact at USAA, the photos of my beat-up Ford Ranger parked on the street while Chloe's BMW sat pretty in the driveway. Every memory, every receipt, every breadcrumb. "You've already built the case," Grandma said. "All that's left now is deciding what you want to do with it." I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition, not from them, but from myself. I wanted to be able to look in the mirror and say I didn't let them define what I stood for. Around midnight, we paused for chamomile tea. Grandma's kitchen smelled like lemon and old wood. She handed me a cup and said, "Petra, baby, your strength was never about what you endured. It's about how you endured it." I let that sink in. Before bed, I texted a JAG officer I trusted and asked to set up a consultation. I wrote up a timeline in my notes app. Not emotional, just facts. I called it the Nance pattern. The next morning, we reviewed everything again. Grandma Iris, in her bathrobe, hair still in curlers, looked like any other sweet old lady baking pies. But she had the mind of a tactician. "You're not going to confront them," she said. "You're going to report the truth, with evidence, with dignity. Let them squirm in the quiet." I smiled for the first time in days. I realized then my grandmother wasn't just a comfort. She was my shield. She was my mirror. And somewhere between the coffee and the sunrise, I understood something deeper. I didn't need their apology. I needed my story. I walked out to the garden as the morning light broke over the picket fence. The rose bushes needed pruning. The mailbox leaned sideways. The air smelled of soil, dew, and something else, something solid, old, rooted. I wasn't a child here. I was Petra Nance, captain in the U.S. Army. But here, I also got to be human. Back inside, I opened my laptop and started a fresh document titled Legacy Not Permission. That would be my outline, not for war, but for truth. If they came at me, I'd already know what page to show. If they tried to twist the story, I'd have receipts. I wasn't going to ask for permission to exist anymore. My past wasn't theirs to own, and the legacy I'd carry forward wasn't for them to bless. It was mine to build. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and watched the sun climb higher over Fredericksburg. I was no longer waiting for their call. I had already answered my own. I arrived at exactly 6 p.m., pulling into the circular driveway of the Nance family estate in Dallas. The house looked the same as it always had, expensive, cold, immaculate. It was the kind of home where everything gleamed, but nothing truly lived. I parked my car and sat for a brief moment, staring at the front door. That door had seen years of me walking in and out, unnoticed, unheard. But today I was no longer that girl. I opened the car door, stood up, straightened my blazer, and marched up the steps like I was walking into a command briefing. Inside, the house was quiet. The faint scent of lemon wood polish lingered in the air. Eleanor sat at the dining table with a glass of wine in hand. Marcus stood by the window, arms crossed, checking his Rolex. Chloe was on her phone, taking selfies with perfect lighting. All three looked up when I entered, like I was interrupting an afternoon photo shoot. "Well, let's get this over with," Marcus said without looking at me. "I have a meeting at 7. I ignored the jab. I walked to the head of the table and placed a thin black leather folder on the polished mahogany surface. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I opened the folder slowly and looked each of them in the eye. "I called this meeting," I began, "to address our family's operating procedures, what in the Army we'd call the rules of engagement." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way this family treats each other, or more precisely, the way you've treated me." Marcus sighed. "Oh God, Petra, this again." "No," I said sharply. "Not this again. This is the first time I've laid it out." I pulled the first sheet from the folder. It was a photo, me at 17, beaming, holding the first place trophy from the state science fair. I slid it across the table. "Item 1, recognition." "That old thing?" Chloe muttered. "That trophy," I said, "was found last month in the garage, propping open the side door." No one replied. I took out 2 more papers. One was a bank statement showing my summer wages at Brewhouse Cafe. The other a purchase invoice for Chloe's birthday BMW. Item 2, investment. One of us paid for her first car. The other got hers after totaling 2. Eleanor made a small noise in her throat, but I pressed on. Item 3, priorities. I laid down a printout of Marcus's email announcing the sale of the Highland Park house. Not a call, not a heads up, just an email. To sell the house I grew up in. Chloe rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." I looked at her coldly. "No, I'm being factual." Marcus straightened. "Are you trying to shame us?" "I'm presenting evidence," I said. "That's what soldiers do when they brief an operation. We present a case, a situation report. That's what this is. A sitrep on a family that's turned one of its own into an outsider." I turned to the final page, a spreadsheet, color-coded, years of birthdays missed, broken promises, inconsistent support, dollar figures, timeline of discrepancies. Eleanor stood up halfway from her chair. This is insane. No, I said, holding her gaze. This is clarity. I closed the folder but didn't put it away. I didn't come here for an apology. I didn't come to beg or to cry. I came to establish new terms. Marcus's mouth twisted into a sneer. Terms? You think this is some kind of negotiation? It's not, I said calmly. This is a declaration. I reached for one last item, a sealed envelope. This is a copy of my updated legal documentation, medical proxy, power of attorney, will. You're being melodramatic, Eleanor snapped. I'm being prepared, I said. I looked at them one by one. I will no longer make myself available for abuse, disguised as family loyalty. I will no longer serve as the silent soldier to your dysfunction. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished. She fell silent. My rank is not a party trick. My career is not a tool, and my presence is not a guarantee. From this point forward, if you want access to me, you meet me on my terms. That includes basic respect. Marcus exhaled loudly. Petra, you're just bitter? No, I said. I'm clear. The room went still. And then, as if rehearsed, Marcus finally exploded. So what? You want us to grovel? To put you on some pedestal? You think just because you wear a uniform, you're better than us? I looked at him, steady and unshaken. No, I think because I wear this uniform, I've learned to stand for something bigger than myself, something you've never bothered to understand. Silence returned. Eleanor sat down again, eyes on the table. Chloe was staring at the floor. I've already booked a moving service, I said. Any of my things that were in the old house can be sent to a P.O. box. You don't need to call. You don't need to email. I slid the folder back into my bag. I'm not cutting you out of my life. I'm just refusing to be cut down by your expectations. As I turned to leave, Marcus said one last thing, his voice quieter now. Is that it? I paused at the doorway, looking back at the home that had never really been mine. No, I said, that's the beginning. And I walked out. Not because I was angry, not because I was defeated, but because for the first time in my life, I was walking on my own terms. The silence after the confrontation wasn't just awkward, it was seismic, the kind that hums through your bones long after the ground has stopped shaking. I sat there, still at the head of the dining table, my hands clasped in front of me, like I had during every mission briefing. But this time, there were no ranks, no protocol, just the aftermath of a lifetime of imbalance, finally tilting toward truth. Across from me, Chloe sat stiffly, eyes red-rimmed, her phone lying untouched, next to her untouched iced tea. Her manicure was chipped. Her mascara had bled into the creases beneath her eyes. For once, she looked human. A quiet sound, a tiny clack, cut through the heavy stillness. She reached into her handbag and placed the Tesla key in the center of the table. Her voice, small but steady, followed. You were right. I looked at her, not as a rival, not as the golden child, just as my sister. I'm sorry, she said. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just that. And for the first time in what felt like years, I believed her. I gave her a slow nod, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. A ceasefire, perhaps. Then I turned to Marcus and Eleanor. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. My mother, normally the first to retort or redirect, had nothing. Her lips were drawn thin, her posture rigid, not defensive, just empty. I've received my PCS orders, I said, letting the words land with precision. Fort Drum, New York. I report in 60 days. They both blinked as if I'd spoken in another language. I'm relocating, and I won't be reachable for casual matters. I paused. This distance, both geographical and emotional, is intentional. Eleanor finally stirred. Petra. I raised a hand, calm and final. No, let me finish. I felt my breath deepen, my spine straightened. For years I tried to belong in this house. I played by the rules you never spoke out loud, but enforced with every slight, every comparison, every silence. I chased approval that was never coming, tried to be small enough to be loved the way Chloe was, until I realized love shouldn't come with conditions. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I don't hate you, but I no longer owe you access to me. Not to my time, not to my service, and certainly not to my peace. Marcus exhaled, a short huff through his nose. So this is it then? You're cutting us off? This, I said, folding my hands again, is a boundary, not a severance. They said nothing. And maybe that was the most honest reaction they'd ever given me. I rose from the table, my chair legs scraping softly against the floor. The meeting is over. I walked slowly toward the hallway, each step deliberate, as if planting a new flag with every footfall. No one followed. At the door, I paused. The brass knob was cool in my hand. The last time I held it, I was a teenager sneaking out past curfew, hoping not to be noticed. Now I turned it without hesitation, without guilt. The sky outside was a watercolor of oranges and purples, the day surrendering to evening. My Ford Ranger waited at the curb, dusty but dependable. I stepped out and let the door close behind me. I didn't slam it. That would have meant I wanted them to hear. But I didn't. The air was warm, almost sweet, with the scent of magnolias and cut grass. I breathed it in. For a moment, I just stood there, not as someone leaving, but as someone arriving into her own authority. As I reached the truck, I glanced once more at the house, not with longing or anger, but clarity. That house had been a cage with expensive furniture and curated photo frames. Now it was just an address I no longer lived at. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The low rumble under me felt like punctuation, a full stop at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. Pulling away from the curb, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me I needed to check on. Ahead was Fort Drum, snow, cold, new terrain. But also new faces, new command, new purpose. It would be lonely, maybe, hard, but it would be mine, and that made all the difference. I turned onto the main road, passing places that had once meant something. My old school, the diner where I had my first job, the gas station I used to sneak candy from. They faded into memory like fog under headlights. Half an hour later, as twilight settled in, I pulled off onto a scenic overlook. Hill country stretched before me, soft, golden, wild. I rolled the window down. The wind carried no voices, only breath, space, quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't need anyone to see me to feel real. Because I saw myself, and she was strong, she was free. She was finally home. 2 months later, the morning sky over San Antonio had softened from its usual blaze. The heat had relented, replaced by a gentler warmth that filtered through thin clouds. I stood beside my SUV, taping shut the final moving box, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet driveway. This time, the silence didn't ache. It held something, settled. My parents had driven in from Dallas, not for a speech, not to demand anything, just to help. It wasn't something I expected, and truthfully, I didn't know how to interpret it. Dad wore an old Texas A&M sweatshirt, sleeves rolled up as he quietly loaded boxes with surprising efficiency. No complaints, no snide remarks, just movement. Mom in jeans and a silk blouse she'd probably never worn for manual labor before, carefully wrapped my dishes in layers of old newspaper. The crinkle of paper, the thump of cardboard, the muted shuffle of feet on gravel. These were our conversations. We didn't say much, and for once, it felt like enough. When the last box was secured and the trunk shut with a solid clunk, I turned toward them, unsure what would come next. A goodbye, another passive-aggressive jab dressed as concern. But then Mom walked over and, without any dramatic pause, hugged me. It wasn't theatrical, not stiff either. It was awkward, a little shaky, but honest. Her perfume, still the same floral blend she'd worn for decades, caught in my throat. She leaned back, eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite read, and said, "Take care of yourself out there, Captain." Captain. The word landed softly but heavily, like snow on an empty branch. It was the first time she'd ever called me that. Dad didn't speak. He simply nodded once, firmly. And in that quiet gesture was something closer to acknowledgement than I'd ever expected to receive from him. There were no promises to call, no suggestions for holidays, no guilt-tripping. They got in their car, started the engine, and drove off. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner of the lot, the gravel crackling faintly beneath their tires. I stood there a long while, not out of sadness, out of peace. 3 months passed. Fort Drum, New York, in October, was an entirely different world from Texas. The mornings were cold enough to sting, the wind sharp as a whispered warning. Frost clung to the grass like crystal armor, and the trees painted the hillsides with gold, amber, and fire red. I stood before my new unit just after dawn. The sky behind me was streaked with pale blue and the last hints of night. My breath curled in the air as I gave the first command of the morning. My voice was calm, steady, solid like bedrock. They listened. That's what struck me most. These soldiers, many of them younger, some older, looked at me not as someone's daughter, not as the second-best sister, but as their commanding officer. Their trust didn't have to be earned through lineage or family prestige. It came from presence, from consistency, from integrity, and that I had in spades. Later that day, I walked the perimeter trail behind the barracks. The forest was alive with sound, leaves crunching beneath my boots, a distant squirrel scampering, the faint rustle of wind through birch and pine. It reminded me of training in remote bases, of nights in the desert when stars felt closer than people. But for once, my solitude wasn't a wound, it was a choice. I passed a bench at the edge of the trail and sat, hands warm in my pockets, eyes on the horizon. Somewhere behind me, soldiers went about their routines. Somewhere back in Texas, the house I grew up in now belonged to strangers, and the war that had raged within me for years had finally gone silent. I thought of Grandma Iris, her voice, that line from Proverbs she'd pointed out in that old leather Bible. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I had spoken, loud enough for my family to hear, clear enough that even their silence afterward was its own kind of answer. And more importantly, I had spoken for myself. My story, my truth, wasn't something to be debated. It was something to be owned. In the quiet of that New York autumn, I understood something I'd never quite grasped before. My family didn't need to accept me for me to accept myself. Their acknowledgement was a luxury, not a requirement. The house in Dallas could be gone. The apologies might never come. The scars they left wouldn't vanish overnight. but I had built a life they couldn't diminish. I had forged meaning out of abandonment, purpose out of pain, not because I needed revenge, but because I deserved peace. That night, back in my on-post apartment, a modest 2-bedroom overlooking the tree line, I unpacked the last of my boxes. The final item I placed was a photograph, me, covered in dust, standing with my old team under a desert sky, grinning. That smile was real, earned, just like everything else. I didn't win some dramatic victory, but I didn't need to. I walked through fire, and I came out steel. If you've ever walked away from a room, not out of anger, but out of dignity, then you understand what I found that morning at Fort Drum. I'm not just telling my story. I know many of you have lived parts of it too. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real, raw, and human, please consider subscribing. Every voice matters, especially the quiet ones.